Hi everybody, how are we doing tonight? We're here. One asked how many weeks we have left, and I said, well, we're 4 weeks in and we've met twice, so we have 4 weeks left, and are quickly losing time. So we're halfway done with the class that's only met 2 times, but we're going to, yeah, we can figure it out. We're going to take our time, get through it, and make decisions after that. Before we get started in class today, Tawana asked me to share some information about the life group pilot that will be starting during Lent. Some of you may have signed up for it already, but she wanted me to pass around the information letter that she is sending out to people about the life groups. The life groups meet at various times and are led by various people. They'll meet 6 times during the season of Lent. Groups of 6 to 10 individuals. Some will meet here, some will meet offsite. But the point is to kind of form a group with which you share life. And so each group will have a curriculum that we've developed, the life group system here at Speak the First UMC. Each group will look similar, but have a diverse set of people connected to them. So take some time when you're bored of what I'm saying to take a look at that letter, learn a little bit about the life groups. And if you're interested in joining one of those, let me know or let Tawana know. She'll be finalizing that system over the next couple of weeks. So take some time to give that attention when you feel like doing so, and let Tawana know. I think it's going to be a really great thing. We're excited about it here. Okay, Bible 101. We have not covered the whole Old Testament like we were supposed to. Pretty sure that even without 2 snow days, we would not have covered the entire Old Testament. But Mother Nature did not help. So let's recap first where we are in our story. Remember in the first week, we looked at the Bible as a whole, talked about how it's created, when it's created, and what it does. And then we dug into the individual chapters, starting with Genesis. In Genesis, in the first part, is that beautiful creation poem, that beautiful creation story, where God creates things, declares they are good, creates more things, declares they are good, and then creates human beings and offers them this chance. Right? And it's reflected in the tree and the garden. And God says, I have created you and I have created the world, and if you want to live in harmony with me, we can live together in this beautiful place, the Garden of Eden as it's depicted in Genesis. But God can't force humanity to obey Him. And so Adam and Eve, the first humans, are faced with this choice to obey God and live in harmony, or to disobey and face the consequences. And of course, they disobey God. They eat of the forbidden fruit of the tree. The one thing God tells them not to do, He says, you can have all of these things, just don't eat that piece of fruit. And the first thing they do is go, that looks like the best piece of fruit, I'm going to eat it. Right? And it's not about the fruit. It was the fruit of knowledge. And so God says to them, trust me, and you won't need this fruit. Right? You don't need to know all the secrets of the universe if you trust in me and my guidance. But if you don't trust me, and you want to see for yourself, then you'll eat that fruit, and then we'll start this chain of events. And so they do eat the fruit, and we saw throughout the rest of Genesis this not-so-slow spiral downwards of humanity as they continue to abandon God and live based on their own needs, their own desires. We see over and over again these characters choosing to disobey God. Right? This choice that we all have every day in our life. To obey God, to disobey God. To follow His guidance, to follow our own desires. To give in to our mortal wants and needs, or to trust that God provides and is there with us. And time and time again, people disobey. Then we got into Exodus, which is mostly the story of the guy Moses. And we've been following Moses and his story, the story of the Israelites, for the last couple of weeks. Remember, Moses is born in Egypt. His mother sticks him in the river, though. The Pharaoh, king of Egypt, is scared that Israelites are going to take over his country here. And so he orders that all the firstborn children, all the firstborn Israelites, should be thrown into the Nile River and killed. Moses' mother can't bring herself to do that. She hides Moses for a long time, but eventually she realizes she can't keep this screaming baby inside of her house. So she puts him in a basket, sends him up the river, and Moses is picked up by the daughter of Pharaoh. She raises Moses as her home. He grows up in the Pharaoh's house, but rebels against Pharaoh and kills an Egyptian Egyptian when he sees an Egyptian guard beating an Israelite. And so Moses kills that Egyptian who's abusing his people, runs to Midian, and then returns to Egypt, and in the end of Exodus brings the Israelites out of Egypt. And that's where we get the plagues being brought down upon Egypt by God, the miracles happening, Pharaoh hardening his heart, the sea parting so that Moses and the Israelites can move through it. And that moves us directly into the next book, which I don't want to get wrong. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus. Yes. Leviticus, we talked about, is this book full of laws. Leviticus comes right after Exodus, and at the end of Exodus, the Israelites, who have literally seen God part seas and create miracles in Egypt, almost immediately choose to disobey. God's getting angry, and Moses is frustrated. They've seen the Ten Commandments, and God we're not really interested in following those all the time. They're quickly spiraling out of control again. And so Leviticus was this book of laws and regulations and rules. But as Christians today, we don't spend much time in because Jesus creates a new covenant with us. Right? When Christ dies for our sins, a new covenant that is different than the covenant written out in Leviticus occurs. But we spent time 2 weeks ago looking at one section in Leviticus, this sacrifice that they do annually. And so we talked about how the Israelites take 2 goats, and I can't draw a goat, so this is the best you're going to get. They take 2 goats every year, draw lots over the goat, and they kill one, letting its blood be a sacrifice for their sin. And they place their sin on top of the other goat and send it out into the wilderness. And this is called the scapegoat. The Israelites place on this goat all their sin, all their misdeeds, all their bad things, send it to the wilderness and get themselves another year. And the reason this is important is because it's a precursor to what we experience in the redeeming power of Jesus Christ. In both parts, his blood washes us clean of our sins. He dies to forgive us and rebuild our relationship with God. And upon him we place the burdens of our sins, this big, powerful burden that almost breaks him down in those final moments. And so, in Leviticus, we see the first inclination that God's people can be saved from their sins, not because they reach a higher point of perfection, but because God intervenes on their behalf. And then we got into the most poorly titled book in the Bible, Numbers, which is not about an accountant's business. It is about this journey of the Israelites in the wilderness. Through the end of Exodus and into Leviticus, they've been somewhere on the Sinai Peninsula, at the foot of Mount Sinai. That's where they built this village where they're waiting for God to signal to them it's time to go to the Holy Land. Okay. But God is choosing to accept their free will in Numbers. And time again, this generation of Israelites has disobeyed God. He said, these are the things you have to do to live in harmony with me, to receive the promises that I offer. And time again, they say, nah, we're not going to do that. We're going to do what we want to do. And so God says, okay, this holy land, I promise you, needs to be preserved. And so this first generation of Israelites who continues to give in to their own needs, continues to sin, continues to disobey me, cannot enter the Holy Land. And this includes Moses, who's still a part of this story. Moses has turned his back on God at least once throughout this story. And so God says to Moses, not even you, who are leading my people, who are doing all this work on my behalf, get to enter the Holy Land. Only your second generation will enter the land that I have promised you. And so, the Israelites set out, and they start to wander in the wilderness. They start to wander as they try to get here to the Holy Land. Which we look at and think, well, that's not very hard. Just go. And it's a pretty short trip. But they wander for 40 years because they can't find their way, and they're distracted by their own needs, and they keep getting off track, and they just wander and wander and wander until at the end of Numbers, they actually find themselves just outside of the Holy Land, on the other side of the Jordan River, from the land that God promised them. And so, we get there tonight as we turn our attention to Deuteronomy. Now, Moses knows that he does not get to enter the Holy Land. The Israelites know that they do not get to enter the Holy Land. And so Moses, in Deuteronomy, is giving this final sermon to this second generation of Israelites. the children of the parents who made all the mistakes after God freed them from Egypt. And Moses knows that he doesn't get to go with them. He knows that it's almost time for them to go into the Holy Land, and he decides that he's going to talk to them about the choices they get to make. He's going to invite them to live differently than their parents. He's going to invite them to live in covenant with God. He's going to invite them to do this thing right. So what we find in Deuteronomy is this long, sometimes over-detailed speech by Moses given to the second generation of Israelites. Now the question many people think is this the speech that Moses gave written down by someone and stenographed and put into the Bible? Well, probably not. Like many of the biblical stories that we hear, this starts as oral tradition, right? The generations of the Israelites telling each other what Moses told them before they entered the Holy Land. And eventually someone goes, we should really write this down. And once they write it down, it continues to circulate as inspiration for the Israelites, and eventually finds its way into our Bible. So don't picture the court reporter sitting next to Moses with a little keyboard typing everything out. But this tradition impacts the way that the Jewish world develops for generations to come and continues to speak to us as Christians. And so let's turn first in Deuteronomy to chapter 1, verse 7. And this is God talking to the Israelites. They've been sitting just outside of the Holy Land. And he says, get going. Enter the hills of the Amorites and the surrounding areas in the desert, the highlands, the lowlands, the arid southern region and the seacoast, the land of the Canaanites and the Lebanon range, all the way to the great Euphrates rivers. Look, I have laid the land before you. Go and possess the land I promised to give to your ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, as well as to their descendants after them. So here, in the opening lines of Deuteronomy, God is reminding the Israelites of the promise he made. He's saying, it's time. Go to this land that I promised your ancestors. Go to this land. And this sets up the first of three sections in the book of Deuteronomy. In the first section are chapters 1 through 11, and they are somber chapters in which Moses reminds this new generation of Israelites about the sins of their parents. He's starting his speech by saying, look, we messed up. We did everything God told us not to. We couldn't keep the covenant. We couldn't stay faithful to God. And we've reaped the consequences of our own decisions. God did not want to punish us, but he allowed us to make our own decisions. He's given us free will, that choice between obeying and disobeying. So then in Deuteronomy chapter 4, verses 15 through 24, Moses showcases the misdeeds of the parents, and he offers new warnings to this generation. So if you will, turn to chapter 4, and we'll start in verse 15. If I can get to the right page. Moses says to this generation, so watch your conduct closely, because you didn't see any form on the day the Lord spoke to you at Horeb, out of the very fire itself. Don't ruin everything and make an idol for yourself, a form of any image, any likeness, male or female, or any likeness whatsoever, whether of a land animal, a bird that flies in the sky, an insect that crawls on the earth, or a fish that lives in the sea. Don't make false idols. Be focused on God. Don't mess this up. Don't look to the skies, to the sun, or to the moon, or to the stars, all the heavenly bodies, and be led astray, worshiping and serving them. The Lord your God has granted these things to all the nations who live under heaven. But the Lord took you and brought you out of that iron furnace, out of Egypt, so that you might be his own treasured people, which is what you are right now. The Lord was angry with me because of your deeds and swore that I couldn't cross the Jordan River or enter the wonderful land that the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance. I will die here, in this land. I won't cross the Jordan River, but you will, and you will take possession of that wonderful land. So all of you, watch yourselves. Don't forget the covenant that the Lord your God made with you by making an idol or an image of any kind or anything the Lord your God forbids, because the Lord your God is an all-consuming fire. He is a passionate God. So there's a lot happening in that as Moses talks to these Israelites. A lot that doesn't make a ton of sense to us. There in starting at 19. Don't look to the skies, to the sun, or to the moon, or the stars, all the heavenly bodies, and be led astray, worshiping and serving them. Moses is telling this generation, when you enter the Holy Land, worship, the same way the Egyptians worshiped, the same way everyone in the old world worships. They're going to worship things. They're going to worship the weather. They're going to worship the crops, the rivers, the skies, the moon, the stars. Don't be tricked. Don't fall for it. Don't give in to the temptation to assimilate with their culture. Remember that the Lord is your God and the only God. Stay true to Him. Moses knows that the second generation will be tempted to turn their backs on God, to live in harmony with the people in the Holy Land. And he says, stay true to who we are. Don't forget the God who led you out of Egypt. Don't forget the God who saved you and offers you new life. Stay true to God. And that's a powerful warning that still speaks to us as Christians today. We're tempted in our lives to worship lots of things, but in Deuteronomy we're reminded that at the center is the worship of God. So then we get to Deuteronomy chapter 5, and Moses reminds the second generation of the Ten Commandments, the commandments that their parents and relatives broke. But chapter 5 is a retelling by Moses of these commandments, in which he says, here are the commandments again, remember them again, live in covenant with God again. We're starting to see a lot of repetitions in Deuteronomy from the book of Leviticus. Moses is deciding that telling them once probably isn't enough. So I'm going to remind them of all the things we've talked about before. Then we get to chapter 6, verses 1 through 7. And we're going to read this and then talk about how important it is to the Jewish tradition and to us today. So Moses gets done talking about the Ten Commandments, reminding them of the mistakes of their parents, reminding them of the laws he set down. And in chapter 6, verse 1, he says, now these are the commandments, the regulations and the case laws that the Lord your God commanded me to teach you to follow in the land that you are entering to possess, so that you will fear the Lord your God by keeping all his regulations and his commandments that I am commanding you, both you and your sons and daughters, all the days of your life, and so that you will lengthen your life. It's all one sentence. Moses was not very succinct speaker. Listen to them, Israel. Follow them carefully, so that things will go well for you, and so that you will continue to multiply exactly as the Lord your ancestors' God promised you, in a land full of milk and honey. You'll hear that time and time again, the land full of milk and honey. And that's just saying that this is a wonderful land that is full of all the things you need to survive, a land of milk and honey. Israel, listen. Our God is the Lord, only the Lord. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your being, and all your strength. These words that I am commanding you today must always be on your minds. Recite them to your children, talk about them when you are sitting around your house and when you are out and about, when you are lying down and when you are getting up. Tie them on your hand as a sign. They should be on your forehead as a symbol. Write them on your house's door frames and on your city gates. We sang, remember these words. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your being, and all your strength. Put a sign on your hand and tattoo it on your forehead. Staple it above your door so that you never forget those words. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your being, and all your strength. In the Jewish tradition, this is called the Shemon. It's a prayer that Jewish people, maybe not today, but certainly traditionally, said 2 times a day, reminding themselves of these words that Moses gives before they are to enter the Holy Land. Love the Lord your God with everything you have and everything that you are. Love God. So the Shemon becomes central to the development of the Jewish tradition, this reminder that in this land full of temptations, in this land full of things that we can get into, we are called to love God above all other things. Many gods are worshipped here, but none of them are God, the Lord of all. None of them are the God of the Israelites. And Moses desperately wants them to remember that. We also see in this passage Moses giving 2 choices to the Israelites that are similar to the choices we've been talking to throughout the Old Testament. He tells them that they are to listen and to love. Listen and love. Now, listening does not just mean that their ears pick up the sounds that are being sent to them. Listening means that they hear and apply and obey God. Right? Listening is obeying God. And love is the motivation through which we are called to obey. So we can't obey God if we don't love God, and we can't love God if we don't obey God. And so this becomes a cycle that the Israelites are called to fall into. Listen and love God. Love God with all you have and all you are. Obey God and obey Him because you love Him. And love Him because you obey Him. It becomes this cycle that they are invited to live into. But Moses and God both know that this is not going to work. Moses has been with these people for 40 years. He's seen the way in which they quickly give in to their human needs, and as he's saying this, going, nah, they're not going to do it. They'll mess it up, probably very quickly. He's convinced that once he dies, things will get even worse because he's the pillar of this community, and he's not sure what's going to happen next. So once again, he lays out the laws for the people, and that's the second section of Deuteronomy, the section that the book gets its name through, chapters 12 through 26. And it's called, Deuteronomy means the second law. So once again, Moses is giving out all these restrictions, all these legal codes, all these guidelines to the Israelites, saying, please, whatever you do, follow these rules. This is what God wants you to do. This is how you live in community with God. Just do it. Please, for my sake, for your own sake, just follow the rules. And you can see he dedicates a huge chunk of this speech, this final sermon he's giving to the Israelites, to this second law. Again, a repeating of much of what's in Leviticus and in the Ten Commandments. He's trying to beat it into their heads with a hammer. Just do it. Can you please learn from our mistakes and do better? And again, in chapters 27 through 34, Moses re-invites the Israelites to listen and to love, and he takes this a step further. He says, if you listen and love God, then you are choosing life. If you don't,
What chapters were those?
choosing death. Yeah, sorry. 27 through 34 is this kind of re-invitation by Moses to listen and love or not. It's a choice between life and death. And we can turn specifically to 30 verses 15 through 20. Chapter 30 verses 15 through 20. Still Moses talking. Look here. Today I've set before you life and what's good versus death and what's wrong. If you obey the Lord your God's commandments that I'm commanding you right now, by loving the Lord your God, by walking in His ways, and by keeping His commandments, His regulations, and His case laws, then you will live and thrive, and the Lord your God will bless you in the land you are entering to possess. But if your heart turns away, and you refuse to listen, and so are misled, worshiping other gods and serving them, I'm telling you right now that you will definitely die. You will not prolong your life on the fertile land that you are crossing the Jordan River to enter and possess. I call heaven and earth as my witness against you right now. I have set life and death, blessing and curse before you. Now choose life, so that you and your descendants will live, by loving the Lord your God, by obeying His voice, and by clinging to Him. That's how you will survive and live long on the fertile land the Lord swore to give to your ancestors, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. This invitation, several times in just that short chunk by Moses, to listen and to love God, to choose life versus death. Now is Moses saying that as soon as the Israelites turn their hearts on God, they'll be struck down by a big bolt of lightning and die? No. He's talking about spiritual death. He's talking about a moral death. He's talking about a death in society, a death in the way in which they live their lives. They won't literally die. They'll live and they'll have children and they'll continue to grow and live in this land. But the point will have been missed. The relationship with God will have been lost. And this opportunity they have to live in the Holy Land as God's chosen people will have been wasted. So Moses, in his final moments, now being in this first chunk of the Bible for 4 books, saying, please, choose life. I didn't, and your parents didn't. We messed up. We chose death. We chose not to listen and to love. Don't do what we did. Do better than we did. But then in chapter 31, verses 7 through 8, Moses decides who's going to take his throne. Then Moses called Joshua, and with all Israel watching, said to him, be strong and fearless, because you are the one who will lead this people to the land the Lord swore to their ancestors to give them. You are the one who will divide up the land for them, but the Lord is the one who is marching before you. He is the one who will be with you. He won't let you down. He won't abandon you. So don't be afraid or scared. So Moses picks Joshua, knowing that he's going to die and knowing that Israel needs a new leader. And it's important and powerful that Moses, in front of all his people, has Joshua come up and says, he's in charge now. Don't fight among yourselves about who's going to take power. Don't get greedy. Don't divide. Follow him. He's the new me. He's got God on his side. He's got God on his back. So just sit down, get in line, and let's go to this place we were promised generations ago. And then, at the end of Deuteronomy, Moses climbs to a mountain. Very, very end. Chapter 34. Moses' death is the heading in my Bible. God comes to Moses and he says, you know, and I know, that you can't enter the Holy Land. But here's what I want you to do. I want you to hike up to Mount Nebo. You'll be on the other side of the river, but you'll be able to see the Holy Land from there. You can see this land I promised, this land you brought your people to. And on that mountain, you will die. So Moses hikes up the mountain. He looks at the Holy Land. He lifts up a prayer, and he dies. No one goes and gets his body. It says at the end of my translation that to this day, no one knows where Moses is buried. But he dies, having set eyes on the Holy Land that God promised, the land that he led his people to. And that's the end of the first 5 books, that first chunk, the Torah. And it's a weird place to end it because we're still anticipating what's going to happen next. Are they going to succeed? Are they going to follow the rules of God? Are they going to get this thing right? And then the story ends. It doesn't end because Joshua picks up right afterwards. But these first 5 books, what the Jewish tradition calls the Torah, is over now. So we spent all this time following the Torah, and it ends on this bit of a cliffhanger. But the Torah is written for people who are outside the Holy Land. The Torah is written for people who do not live in relationship with God. The Torah invites those on the outside to live with a hope that a relationship with the God who loves us can be built. So all these stories, as much as they do tell the history of the Israel people, a history of creation, the history of God's relationship with these people, is also a reminder to us and to the world today to hope in God, to hope in that relationship, and to hope in a better future with the God who didn't abandon these people and will not abandon us. We're not done for the night, but before we move on to Joshua and kind of close the book on the Torah, any questions out there?
Is this like Sermon on the Mount, where they had church on Sunday? Was he just preaching whenever he felt like it? Always outside or in the tent? You know,
Yeah, well,
I know we don't know.
several questions, some of which I have answers to. No, they don't do church on Sunday. Saturday
They did Saturday.
is the holy day. No, they would not have been in the tabernacle because God's presence is still in the tabernacle. Right, so they're still carrying that tent that they built at the bottom of Mount Sinai with them. They're still carrying the Ark of the Covenant, and they're all still too impure to be that close to the presence of God. So they're not going into the tent sitting next to God because they can't handle the power that God has, the purity of God. We talked a little bit about that a couple weeks ago. So yeah, it is Moses outside, backed by the Holy Land, trying to convince this group in a sermon-like fashion of how to live, giving them that choice between life and death, telling them to listen and to love God. And he's Moses, so when he starts talking, I imagine people kind of get quiet and listen. So is it on a Saturday connected to church? Probably not. It's probably him going, okay, we're here. Before I let you go, I've got one more thing to say. Any more questions?
Well, it sounds like there's no forgiveness. Like, if you screw up once, you're,
Well,
because Moses was considered to be dead or dead.
yeah, well, there's forgiveness to a degree. Right? God does not turn his back on the Israelites even though they fail him time and time again. Right? Even when they're wandering in the wilderness in numbers because they keep ignoring God and doing what they want, God is still there. And last week we looked at the end of Numbers there in Moab, and a priest is up on a mountain. The Israelites have no idea that he's there, and he's trying to send curses down upon the Israelites, and God keeps intervening and turning those curses into blessings. So even when the Israelites don't know it, God is protecting them and defending them and working for them. So God forgives them and wants to be in this relationship with him, but the promised land, this land that he's promised Abraham and his generations, he wants to keep pure. He wants to have this chance to really build what he originally tried to start with Adam and Eve, and he knows that this first generation can't go in there because they've already shown they can't handle it. Right? And so he's hoping that by letting the second generation in that hasn't chosen to disobey him yet, it will go right. So it's not that he's not forgiving the Israelites. He's staying in community with them. He's staying in relationship with them. He continues to protect them. But he knows that they can't fit the bill that he needs in this new land. And it will be shown throughout the rest of the Old Testament that neither can this new generation of Israelites. And Joshua will see they quickly turn their back on God and continue to mess up because that's what we do. So, different type of forgiveness. Anything else? Okay, let's move on to Joshua. Joshua is named after the new leader of the Israelite people, the one that Moses blessed and said, this guy's in charge, Joshua. And so Joshua is going to take the Israelites into the Holy Land over the river of Jordan and is going to establish their dominance in this land. Remember, it's the oldest story in the book. Just because the Israelites want this place doesn't mean there aren't people living there. They show up, and there are a lot of folks living there who are saying, you can't, no, this is not your home, this is my home, that's my house, he's my king, this is our army, please go away. So the Israelites have to fight for the land that God has promised them. They're fighting against what is kind of globally called the Canaanites, and throughout Joshua and the Old Testament, they will have different tribal names given to them. Canaanites is kind of the general word that we hear. So Joshua is kind of completing this story for us. God promises to Abraham, you will get the Holy Land, you are my chosen people, and that creates Israel. Moses takes Israel out of Egypt, gets them to the Holy Land, and now Joshua's going to pull them out of the wilderness, and finally, kind of put a bookend on this story that we've been following. And it happens in 4 movements. Verses 1 through 5 is Joshua leading the people. They're literally going to walk in to the Holy Land. Verses 6 through 12 is the Israelites fighting the Canaanites. Because remember, there are people there, and they like their homes. Verses 13 through 22 is somewhere we're not going to spend a lot of time in because it's fairly boring. It's where Joshua divides the land between the 12 tribes of Israel. It's like having a map described to you without any pictures. If there was a chunk of this book that you were going to skip, I recommend that it be verses 13 through 22 because you can Google a map of the 12 tribes of Israel, and that'll more or less do the job for you. And then 23 through 24, like Moses, is Joshua offering his final words to the Israelites. He too is going to die, and before he does that, he has something to share with his people. Okay? So let's jump in first. Joshua chapter 3, starting at verse 5. Joshua said to the people, make yourselves holy. Tomorrow the Lord will do wonderful things among you. Then Joshua said to the priests, lift up the covenant chest, the ark of the covenant. Go along in front of the people. And so they lifted up the covenant chest and went in front of the people. The Lord said to Joshua, today I will begin to make you great in the opinion of all Israel. Then they will know that I will be with you in the same way that I was with Moses. So God's talking to Joshua and saying, they may not trust you yet, but by the end of the day they're going to know that I am with you and that you are to be trusted as their leader. You are to command the priests to carry the covenant chest. As soon as you come to the bank of the Jordan, stand still in the Jordan. Joshua said to the Israelites, come close, listen to the words of the Lord your God. Then Joshua said, this is how you will know that the living God is among you, and will completely remove the Canaanites, Hittites, Hivites, Perizzites, Girgashites, Amorites, and Jebusites. Say that 5 times. Before you. Look, the covenant chest of the ruler of the entire earth is going to cross over in front of you in the Jordan. Now pick 12 men from the tribes of Israel, 1 per tribe. The soles of the priest's feet who are carrying the chest of the Lord, ruler of the whole earth, will come to rest in the water of the Jordan. At that moment, the water of the Jordan will be cut off. The water flowing downstream will stand still in a single heap. So God is recreating for the Israelites this kind of bookend to what starts as they leave Egypt. Moses leads them through the Red Sea. The sea stops and it parts, and they are able to walk on dry land. And so God says to Joshua, we're gonna do this trick again. Walk into the Jordan, it will split in half, and you will walk with my covenant through the Jordan on dry land into the Holy Land. So we're literally making Joshua a new Moses. God knows that these people need a strong leader to guide them, and so he's recreating this great miracle that he's already done, and he does. They take the covenant, they step into the river, and it parts, and the Israelites walk through the Jordan River into the Holy Land. So then, we jump to Joshua 5, 13 through 15. When Joshua was near Jericho, he looked up. He caught sight of a man standing in front of him with his sword drawn. Joshua went up and said to him, "Are you on our side or that of our enemies?" He said, "Neither. I'm the commander of the Lord's heavenly force. Now I have arrived." Then Joshua fell flat on his face and worshipped. Joshua said to him, "What is my master saying to his servants?" The commander of the Lord's heavenly force said to Joshua, "Take off your sandals of your feet, because the place where you are standing is holy." So Joshua says, "What do you mean, neither? I mean, you're the angel of the army of God, so here I am bowing down. What does God tell you?" And the guy says, "Take off your shoes." Show a little respect here, guy. So the question is, Joshua is chosen by God to lead the Israelites in. He finds the commander of the Lord's heavenly force, asks, "Are you on our side or their side?" And he says, "Neither." Why? God's chosen the people. Why wouldn't he say, "Yeah, the commander of my holy force is on your side. Let's go get the Canaanites out here and get this thing done"? He says neither because it's a reminder to Joshua and to the Israelite people that they have a choice. Right? It's this reintroduction of the listen and love, obey or disobey. The Lord's angel of his army is going to be on their side until they choose to disobey. And that doesn't mean that he's going to turn an army on the Israelites, but they have to live in this harmony with God. They have to follow those rules to get that blessing, to be in that relationship with God. So he says neither, because he knows that these are human beings he's working with, and there's a good chance that they're going to mess it up at some point. And he doesn't belong to Joshua. He belongs to God. He doesn't belong to Joshua. He doesn't belong to the Canaanites. He belongs to God and is there to do God's will. And so that kicks off these long battles in which Joshua goes and basically takes out all the people in these lands that he is supposed to live in. That's the second section here, the battles between the Israelites and the various tribes of Canaan. And there's two that I think are important for our purposes. And it's the first two battles of that second section. The battle at Jericho and the battle at Ai. We've got Jericho. Yeah. Now Jericho, the Israelites win because they do what God tells them to do. He says, "Circle the city and have your priests get trumpets, horns made out of ram's horns, and you're going to march around the city and you're going to blow the horns, and the city wall will fall down. You'll be able to take Jericho and it will become a part of your kingdom, part of Israel." And so they do exactly what God says. They do God's will. They obey, and they win. They do exactly what God tells them to do. They circle the city, they blow the horns, the walls fall down, they take Jericho. Man, this is going to be easy. This is going exactly the way we're supposed to do. But during the Battle of Jericho, an Israelite takes some of the loot for himself. He sneaks into the city, says, "Ooh, here's a nice chest of goodies. I'm going to take that and I'm going to keep it for myself." That was not what God told them to do. So at the Battle of Ai, these people, under the leadership of Joshua, have already started to disobey God. Greed took over as soon as they won their first fight in this new land. As soon as Jericho fell, they started to give in to their human temptations. They started to forget the commandments of God. They stole money. They used it for themselves. And so I, having chosen to disobey, they lose. Of course, they go to God and go, "Well, what happened? We won the first battle. That was easy, but the second one, we lost." And God says to them, "Look, you have to choose to obey. I'm not just going to give you these things. This is about you living in relationship with me, When you choose to disobey, things aren't going to go the way that we plan for them to go. Choose to live in harmony with me. Israel must obey God to inherit the lands that he has promised them. And that's the story we get there in the first chunk of verses 6 through 12. And then the rest of that section is these Israelites slowly defeating their enemies. They go from town to town. They take out their enemies. They conquer the lands. And in Joshua 11, verse 16, we see a summary of Israel's victory. The whole verse kind of moves through. And it says, "So Joshua took this whole land, the highlands, the whole arid southern plain, the whole land of Goshen, the lowlands, the desert plain, and both the highlands and the lowlands of Israel. He took land stretching from Mount Halak, which goes up toward Seir, as far as Baal-Gad at the foot of Mount Hermon in the Lebanon valley. He captured all their kings, he struck them down and killed them. Joshua waged war against these kings for a long time. There wasn't one city that made peace with the Israelites except the Hivites who lived in Gibeon. They captured every single one in battle. Their stubborn resistance came from the Lord and led them to wage war against Israel. Israel was enabled to wipe them out as something reserved for God without showing them any mercy. This was exactly what the Lord had commanded Moses." So the Israelites won. They have this land. They've conquered the kings. They've built this territory. And as followers of Jesus, we start to ask this question, that doesn't sound like the God Jesus tells us to love. Jesus tells us to love our neighbors. This God says, go kill all the bad guys. Go win the big bloody war. What's that all about, right? Does God cause this genocide of the Canaanites? Because in some places we get language like, wipe them all out, destroyed the city. There was nothing left. And we think, ooh, that's not the God that Jesus really talked about. The God that Jesus talked about is not dropping nuclear bombs all over the Israelite lands to take over this kingdom. And then it's more confusing because you'll read, just after we wiped them all out, the Canaanites still lived in the city after the Israelites conquered it. If you wipe them all out, how are there still Canaanites living in the city with you? And there's laws written saying, hey, don't marry the Canaanites. Well, are there Canaanites? Did you wipe them all out? What is happening here? We see here displayed better than most places the hyperbole that exists in the Old Testament. They're not literally wiping out entire cities. Right? It just doesn't make sense. Because they'll say, we wiped them out, but they're still here. Then you probably didn't wipe them out, guys. They're not all dead if they're not all dead. But there's hyperbole at work. Right? These are important stories for the Israelite people. This is an important part. This is their Revolutionary War. This is where they get their home. This is where they get their land. And so there's a little bit of hyperbole. There's a little bit of patriotism at work. And they're talking about, yeah, we just won every single battle. No one got in our way. We did it, baby. We did it. That doesn't mean everyone is gone. It doesn't mean that God is condoning this slaughtering of people. He's giving the land of promise to his people. But there's hyperbole at work here. We also see that there are Canaanites who see the Israelites and choose to turn to their God and live in relation. Right? The people of Gibeon decide, you know what? We like this God. We believe in this God. And they choose to follow the Israelites and join in the cause. So we see that happening. But really, what we're seeing at work here is this telling of this unique moment in Israel's history, this foundation of their home, the start of their life outside of Egypt, outside of the wilderness, finally in this land that God had promised them. So rest easy. The God of Israel and the God of Christ is the same God, even though sometimes it can get a little confusing when we read some of these books. Okay. Verses 13 through 22 is the division of Israel. Again, we're not going to read that because it's Joshua in his old age sitting and saying, okay, we won. There's 12 tribes. You each get a chunk of this land. So here are the parameters of your land. It's going to run from this mountain down this creek to this bundle of trees and then roll over to this meadow and then up to this hill and then up the other river and then down over towards the other mountain and then there's going to be a creek. But at that creek, you're going to want to turn towards the pond, not the lake. And he's just describing the territory that is given to the 12 tribes of Israel. Each tribe picks a leader. In the next book, they will be called judges, but they're not guys with the long robes sitting with a gavel. They're tribal warlords. Right? They're military leaders of these 12 tribes of Israel who are going and taking care of their different lands. And in verses 23 through 24, or chapters 23 and 24, we find Joshua's last words. And I want us to turn to chapter 24, verse 14. Joshua, like Moses, has led the people. He's taken them to the Holy Land. They've conquered the Holy Land, this land promised to them. He's divided it up among the tribes. He says this, "So now, revere the Lord. Serve him honestly and faithfully. Put aside the gods that your ancestors served before the Euphrates and in Egypt, and serve the Lord. But if it seems wrong in your opinion to serve the Lord, then choose today whom you will serve. Choose the God whom your ancestors served beyond the Euphrates, or the gods of the Amorites in whose lands you live. But my family and I will serve the Lord." And then the people answered, "God forbid that we ever leave the Lord to serve other gods. The Lord is our God. He's the one who brought us and our ancestors up from the land of Egypt, from the house of bondage. He has done these mighty signs in our sight. He has protected us the whole way we've gone and in all the nations through which we passed. The Lord has driven out all the nations before us, including the Amorites who lived in this land. We too will serve the Lord because he is our God." Then Joshua said to the people, "You can't serve the Lord because he is a holy God. He's a jealous God. He won't forgive your rebellion and your sins. If you leave the Lord and serve foreign gods, then he will turn around and do you harm and finish you off in spite of having done you good in the past." Then the people said to Joshua, "No, the Lord is the one we will serve." So Joshua said to the people, "You are witnesses against yourselves that you have chosen to serve the Lord." And they said, "We are witnesses. So now put aside the foreign gods that are among you. Focus your hearts on the Lord, the God of Israel." The people said to Joshua, "We will serve the Lord our God and will obey him." Joshua was testing the people here in these final moments. He says, "You're going to serve God?" They say, "Absolutely we're going to serve God. Look at all he's done. Look at all he's given us. We're going to serve him. He is our God." And then he says, "Well, God will be mad if you disobey him." He says, "Oh, well, we're still going to follow God. Following God is hard. We're still going to follow God. You're watching it. You're all saying it. You're going to follow God? Yeah, we're going to follow God. We're going to do it. We're going to do it." He says, "Okay. Remember what you said to yourself and to each other and to me and to God. You have promised here and now to serve the Lord your God." He's reminding them of that call from Moses to listen and to love. Saying, obey God. You said it to yourselves. You said it to me. You said it aloud for God to hear. Don't forget. Joshua's dying words, reminding the people of Israel, now in this land that God has promised them, with their whole world, their whole future ahead of them, saying, don't forget the Lord your God. And that closes out the story of Joshua and gets us into the story of Judges. And Judges begins very quickly to look like the last part of Exodus, where time and time again, people choose to disobey God, and in that disobedience, they start to spiral out of control. Now, the title of the book comes from those leaders that we talked about, the people who take over the tribes of Israel, those military warlords, those tribal chieftains, the judges, as they are called in the tradition. And what the story is this development of a cycle among the Israelite people. They start off okay, but then it starts to go awry. Can't read my own handwriting, that's always good. Da-da-da-da. That's Ruth, and we're not going to get there today. Okay, here we go. So the Israelites get in this cycle. First, they screw up, and they start to live in sin. And in that sin, they become oppressed by themselves, by others, by greed, by pain, by suffering. In some way, it's different in different times, they become oppressed. And then, in their sorrow, they repent. God, hearing their repentance, seeing their sorrow, appoints a new judge, a new leader of the Israel people who restores them, and he lets them live in this period of peace. And once peace is restored, they quickly find their way back to sin. And this doesn't happen once in the book of Judges. It doesn't happen twice in the book of Judges. It happens over and over and over again. The people start to live pretty good. They're feeling pretty comfortable, and so they start to do things that they know they shouldn't do. But things are going great, so it's okay. And then it gets worse, and it gets worse, and they can't stop themselves, and this oppression, this sorrow, this pain, this suffering sneaks in. And they start crying, God, we're so sorry. We messed up bad this time. We know it. We're not going to do it again. We promise. We realize the error of our ways. We repent to you, God. He appoints a judge. And he says, okay, let's try it again. Let's do better this time. time, this person is going to lead you out. I've picked the best among you, which, as we'll see in this story, are not always very good people in of themselves. Right? Not God condoning the behavior of the judges, but God working with what the Israelites are giving him. Then they get back to this period of peace, each time a little less peaceful than the time before, and it all starts again. So that's the cycle. And that cycle is written out for us in Judges chapter 2. The narrator of the story, as he's beginning this book about the judges, says this is the cycle. This is what they do over and over and over again, trying to learn their lesson. Don't fall into this cycle yourself of sinning and finding sorrow and begging God for repentance and getting that repentance and then just falling right back into the trap. Don't live like these people did.
Yeah.
And the rest of the book, yeah, Carl.
Does the cycle go every second or third generation, or is there a relation though?
It's hard to say that there's relations because of the way that it's structured. And so we'll look, the first 3 judges, we get pretty quick and succinct stories of them. They kind of set the rhythm. The other judges we get different stories of, but there's reasons to believe that there are judges in between that we're not told about. So we just don't know, is this generational? How often does this happen? Really, the story is not about how often the cycle happens, but that the cycle happens. And every time God saves these people, they just mess it up again. And it gets worse every time. So the first 3 judges are captured in verses 3a, 3b, and 4 through 5. The first one is Othniel.
What chapter are you in?
3.
Okay.
Then you have Ehud, and then Deborah. And so in verses or chapters 3 through 5, you get the first 3 judges that saved Israel. They set the pace. They kind of tell you pretty quickly and succinctly what this story is. So we'll look at that first one in chapter 3 to get an idea of what the model judge looks like. Okay? So, chapter 3, verse 7. The Israelites did things that the Lord saw as evil. Yep, they're sinning. And they forgot the Lord their God. They served the Baals and the Asherahs, these are other gods. The Lord became angry with Israel and gave them over to King Cush-an-Rithahethahim of Aram-naharaimnah. Oppression. This time it's literal. God gets mad and says, okay, here's another king. You're not going to listen to me, here's this guy. And $5 to anyone who can pronounce those words. But then they cried out to the Lord. Oh, they're so very sorry. So the Lord raised up a deliverer for the Israelites, Othniel, Kenza's son. God brings them a judge. The Lord's spirit was in Othniel, and he led Israel. When he marched out for war, the Lord handed over Aram's king Cush. There he is again. And Othniel beat the king, and the land was peaceful for 40 years until Othniel died. So that's the story, over and over and over again. The Israelites sin, then they're oppressed, and in that first case it's literal. Another king comes in, conquers the territory, and is their king. And they scream out to God and say, we're sorry, we really messed up, we need your help. He saves them, and there's peace, and often it is until the judge dies. Right? This judge saves them, and so they go, this guy, he knows what he's doing, we're going to follow him or her. And then they die, and they go, okay, let's try this sinning thing again. The cycle starts. And so in 3b, the cycle starts again, and Ehud saves them. And in 4 through 5, the cycle starts again, and Deborah saves them. And those are the good judges. The judges that do the job, that listen to God, that live in harmony. But every time this cycle completes itself, the society of Israel as a whole gets worse and worse and worse. And so the judges that they're going to get worse and worse and then horrifying. And so it breaks into a few more sections. Verses 6 through 9 is okay. The Israelites are all right. The judge that is raised up is Gideon. And Gideon is kind of a coward. But Gideon comes to recognize that God can and will support him, and that with God he can conquer the enemies of Israel. So Gideon finds the strength, and he goes and he defeats the oppressor of the Israelites. But Gideon gets a little power hungry, and he's angry at the people who wants revenge and is angry after he does God's work and brings peace to the Israelites. After Gideon, in chapters 10 through 12, we're introduced to Jephthah. And he's not very good. He's a pretty bad guy. Now he won lots of battles. The Spirit of God was with him. He released the Israelites from their oppressors, and he did all of that work. But afterwards, he really came to like the money that came with winning things. And then he created a false idol, and then he and his people began to worship that false idol. And so the judge that saved them also led them into this new period of sin. He's not very good at what he does. And then 13 to 16 gives us Samson. And Samson is the worst of the judges. Right? Again, Samson wins the battles and beats the oppressors, but Samson is actually this Israelite from up in the mountains. He's not living down in the community with the rest of them. He's this kind of rural tribal leader, and so he's forgotten God. He doesn't understand the character of God, and so to win the battles, he says to God, I'll kill my daughter if you let me win the fights. God says, no. I specifically said, don't kill your children for me. That's what the Canaanites do, not what I do, not what you do. Don't. Samson has completely forgotten everything that Joshua and Moses told the Israelites before they came into this holy land. They've forgotten the very character of God, and it shows in Samson how far down Israel has spiraled out of control. Right? These people have just lost sight of who God is, what God offers, and how to live in relationship with that God. And then as the book ends, 17 and 18 and 19 through 24, these last sections speak to Israel as a society and shows the societal damage of Israel, the societal turning away from God. And Judges is a pretty graphic book. Really bad things happen in Judges. And the author of Judges does not try to hide how bad those things are. And as the book goes on, things get worse and worse and more horrifying. And it culminates at the very end, and we're going to end on a very low note tonight. But yeah, it gets so much better when we move on to read. But in Judges chapter 19, we find the story of the Levite, a woman, and her father. So this Levite woman is married to a man. She is his second wife. She does not like the man. She does not love the man. So she returns to her father. And her dad kind of tries to keep the guy around when he comes looking for her, but eventually her husband takes her back home. So this woman and her husband are riding through the lands, and she says, let's stop in this city and rest for the night. And he says, no, those aren't Israelites. We're going to stop in Gibeon. So they keep going, they get into Gibeon, and they spend the night in this man's house. This old man takes them in, he feeds them, he takes care of the donkeys they're traveling with. But in the middle of the night, this raucous crowd shows up outside the man's door. They start beating on the door, and they say, give us that man so we can rape him and beat him and murder him. And this old man says, no, you don't want to do that. These are guests, these are foreigners, these are travelers. Let's leave them alone. Don't do this. And then, in truly chivalrous fashion, he says, I'll give you my daughter and his wife instead. I'll open the door, throw them out, you leave us alone, and do whatever you're going to do to them. And so he does. He throws out this Levite woman, this man's second wife, and the crowd beats her, abuses her, and rapes her. And the next morning, she is sitting in the doorwell of the house, exhausted and close to death, and her husband says, get up, it's time to go. And she can't get up, so he picks her up, and he throws her over the back of his donkey, and rides with her, and when they get home, she's dead. And he cuts her into 12 pieces and spreads her to the 12 tribes of Israel. Right? Not a bedtime story. God is not at work in those moments. Israel has forgotten God. Israel has turned their back on God. And the deepest pervasions of humanity are starting to exist in this society. And in chapter 20, a civil war breaks out over this entire ordeal. The Israelites see this, and even by their own societal standards, are shocked and amazed at what this man has done. And so in chapter 20, we read in the first verse, Then all the Israelites, from Dan to Beersheba, as well as from the area of Gilead, marched out, and the group assembled as one body in the Lord's presence as Mizpah. The commanders of the people and of all the tribes of Israel took their place in the assembly of God's people, 400,000 foot soldiers armed with swords, and the Benjamites got word that the Israelites had marched up to Mizpah. The Israelites inquired, "Tell us how this evil act happened." So the Levite, the husband of the murdered woman, answered, "My secondary wife and I came to Gibeah of Benjamin to spend the night, and the leading citizens of Gibeah tried to attack me. They surrounded me in the house at night, and they were determined to kill me. They abused my secondary wife until she died," leaving out the part about he and the old man pushing her out the door so that they didn't get beat up. "I took her, chopped her up, and sent her pieces into every part of Israel's territory, because they had committed this disgraceful act in Israel. All you Israelites, say what you think should be done here and now." And so he does not take any responsibility for what has happened. He chose not to stop at the first city. He chose not to stand up and do anything. But he says, "Okay, Israelites, what are you going to do? This is as low as you've hit. What's your response?" So the Israelites go and they destroy the Benjamites, the people in this city who carried out this horrible act. And a literal civil war breaks out between the 12 tribes of Israel. Only a few generations removed from Moses, from God, taking them out of Egypt and giving them this holy land, asking them to obey him and to live in covenant, to listen and to love. But at every turn, they're choosing to disobey. They're not listening and loving. So Moses' prophecy was correct. They can't do this. They can't live in the way that God is asking them to live. They keep giving in to their own needs, their own desires, their own wants. This is what it causes. That is a bad place to end the night, but we're over time. Next week, we're going to start in the book of Ruth. And the book of Ruth actually takes place kind of layered over the book of Judges. It starts within the time when the judges were ruling. And the book of Ruth is this wonderful story of how, even in the midst of all this horror, God and people are doing good things. And it's actually an uplifting book, a beautiful book. And so we'll be able to open on a high note next week. Before we leave, anyone have any questions? I'm sure you have lots of questions, but ones that I can answer. All right, we'll see you next week. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.